We finally got the September 2025 ban list, and it brings a lot of changes to our metagame. What's up guys, my name is Tcg Sam, and in today's video I'm going to be covering what I feel are going to be the best decks post ban list. I'm only going to be focusing on the decks that were directly impacted by the ban list, so if you don't see a certain deck on here, I'm most likely going to be able to cover it during the next best decks tier list video, which is going to come out after Doom of Dimensions. But in this video I just want to focus on the decks that were directly impacted by the ban list and sort of see how they fare in our current metagame. So of course, I think the tiers are pretty self-explanatory. Solid tier 1, these are decks I think that are still going to be very good. Tier 1 potential, I think that are decks that maybe lack something like consistency or ceiling, but could still be a very potent threat in the metagame. Tier 2, I think these decks are like fine, nothing exceptional, but not terrible either. And then the last tier, I think, are decks that you just probably shouldn't consider. So without any further ado, let's hop straight into it. Starting off with Yummy. Yummy did get Herald down to 1 and Obedience School down to 1 as well. I don't think these hits are like too relevant. I mean, don't get me wrong, Obedience School was definitely one of the best starters in the Yummy deck, but the Yummy deck was still able to do so much off of just a single Yummy monster a lot of times that even with only one access to Obedience School, the deck is still going to be very powerful. You can also just directly replace Obedience School with more consistency cards like Pot of Prosperity or with cards like Puri Reese Map, so I don't think that Yummy is going to really suffer too much from this ban list. Second Herald, most lists weren't even playing it to begin with, so I think that hit isn't really too significant. It's mainly just the Obedience School to 1. Now, all that being said, for the upcoming format, I think Yummy is still definitely going to be one of the best decks that we have, and especially once we get Doom of Dimensions and they get their new main deck monster, I think Yummy is going to get even better. So, despite the hits to Yummy, I think that Yummy is still probably one of the best decks, if not the best deck in the current format that we have right now, especially post-ban list, after other decks have been weakened. But speaking of a deck that wasn't weakened at all, and that's Draco Tail. Draco Tail didn't receive any hits at all, and I personally don't think that they needed to. Like, the deck was doing fine in the metagame overall. It wasn't particularly dominant. It didn't even show up at Worlds, so I feel like they had no reason to really hit Draco Tail. So even though at the start of the video I said I was only going to talk about decks that were directly impacted by the ban list, I think that Draco Tail in some way was pretty indirectly impacted. Its worst matchup in K9 Vanquish just took a massive hit, and I think that makes it so Draco Tail can actually surge up to the solid tier 1 category. It definitely becomes a little bit better than before since the Vanquish matchup was pretty abysmal, but now that Vanquish is, in my opinion, effectively gone, I feel like Draco Tail is going to have its chance to shine, especially if Yummy is the best deck. Draco Tail has a pretty solid matchup into the Yummy deck, meaning if there's a time for Draco Tail to really shine, I think it's now. It was a powerful deck before the ban list, but I think it just gets even better because all of its competition just got a little bit worse post ban list. Speaking of its competition, K9 Vanquish I think unfortunately was the biggest loser of this ban list, losing 2 copies of Raisin and 2 copies of Stake Your Soul. This is something that's very detrimental to the Vanquish engine. It's not as simple as just trying to replace those extra lost copies of Raisin with like more fire monsters like the Rescue Ace engine or cards like Dog Runner or Kurikara, or even replacing them with cards like Small World. These cards are not nearly of the same quality as Vanquish Raisin, and even if you can argue that like Small World is a consistency card, it just really isn't the same because it isn't a monster attribute. And that's sort of the most important thing you want to consider when building a deck with Vanquish. This deck essentially lost 4 of its starters, and there just aren't really any good cards that can sort of fill that void. In my opinion, I think that the way this deck is going to be played now is probably going to be more of a heavy K9 engine. They might max out on copies of Case and sort of just try to lean more heavily on the K9 side of the deck as opposed to the Vanquish side, because the Vanquish deck still does have like some solid level 5s like Jiaolong and Holy Su, but for the most part, since you're not going to be able to see Raisin that often now, your deck is mainly going to be more focused on the K9 part. I think that especially post Doom of Dimensions, once we get the new K9 support, I think this deck could make a little bit of a resurgence because the K9 normal summon is pretty good for the deck. It does allow it to tutor out Yugioh a lot easier, and that's something that could help them dig into the correct Vanquish names and attributes. But until we get that, I feel like this deck is actually just going to be a tier 2 deck. Like, it still has like the same capabilities as it did before, but I think that losing 4 of its starters is such a big consistency hit to the deck that I just really don't think it's going to be too relevant in the metagame anymore. Of course, the Vanquish player could still high roll and see all the correct attributes and all that, but for the most part, the deck is not going to be nearly as consistent as it was before, and plus it was already struggling with consistency even before the hit. So overall, all that is to say is I don't think this deck is necessarily dead and unplayable, but it just becomes so much more inconsistent that I'm not really sure it's worth even considering. And then the next deck I want to talk about is like more of the quote-unquote pure Vanquish Soul. So like there were some builds running around playing like a much smaller K9 engine, maybe like one copy of Jokel or something, and playing Pot of Extravagance. I think that this build suffers a little bit more than the K9 build, and I'm actually going to put it in the bottom tier because I don't think this deck is really playable anymore. While yes, Pot of Extravagance is still a very strong consistency card, the deck just doesn't really have anything to fall back on other than its Vanquish Soul engine. At least in the K9 build, there are going to be times where like, yeah, you only see K9 cards, but at least the K9 cards can like get you something, as opposed to just like the pure version of the deck, which can maybe play more hand traps, but those hand traps aren't necessarily going to be nearly as good engine as the K9 cards are going to be. So overall, I don't think that this version of Vanquish Soul is going to be playable, unfortunately. This consistency is just hit way too much. I'll reiterate again, like I think that in my opinion, the Vanquish Soul deck isn't necessarily dead, but you probably do need to play a much bigger K9 engine for it to really even be competitive. Another K9 deck that was hit on the ban list was K9 Crystron. As someone who plays this deck, Crystron inclusion to 1 is actually pretty significant. It's not just a matter of hitting its consistency, but it also makes it so every time you activate inclusion, you actually don't have the opportunity to send another one off of Salvador, and that can make some combo lines a little bit more awkward. It's not to say like it completely ruins every single combo in the deck because you only have one, because you still have ways to pop the inclusion. You can pop it with like Solfefnir's other effect, you can pop with Salvador's effect, but I feel like it makes some combo lines a little bit more awkward and sort of forces you into certain lines of play that may be weaker into some hand traps. Not to mention, of course, losing 2 inclusion is still a pretty significant consistency hit, but I feel like the fix in this deck is at least a little bit easier than the K9 deck. You could make the argument that like, hey, seeing the K9 cards are like almost just as good as seeing the Crystron cards, because the K9 cards alone can bridge into the Crystron cards really easily. So overall, while I think the deck did take a fairly significant hit, I think it's still going to be a deck with very strong tier 1 potential. This is a deck that's like just below solid tier 1 right now, and at the top, very top of tier 1 potential, because I think that while this hit was significant, the deck is not dead by any means. And especially with the new Doom and Dimension support coming out in the future, I think this deck is going to see its resurgence then. But until we get that new support, I think for now, it's just going to be a solid deck with some tier 1 potential, but slightly worse than the decks up here. Next up is Malice. So Malice did lose 1 copy of Dormouse, and it did lose Splash Mage, and I think that Splash Mage hit is definitely the more significant one. It makes it so your combo lines are a little bit more awkward, and it can make a card like Nibiru feel a little bit more impactful against the deck. Without being able to turn 2 monsters into like 3 right away, you're going to have to use a card like Haggard Lizardos to sort of burn through a Malice Banish effect before bringing it back and then being able to link into one of your link 3s. That is a fairly significant hit to the ceiling of Malice in my opinion, and not to mention, of course, losing 1 Dormouse does hit its consistency even more. Malice is a deck that was already sort of struggling with its consistency, and I think that losing another copy of Dormouse certainly doesn't really help that. That being said though, I think this deck is still very well and alive. Like even with no Splash Mage, it doesn't really ruin a lot of the combo lines. You do sort of have to switch them up a little bit, and they are a little bit more vulnerable to a card like Nibiru now, but I still feel like this deck is very solid overall. It definitely still has a lot going for it. And so for that reason, I'll put it at like middle of tier 1 potential. I think this is definitely a deck that's still going to be competitive, but not necessarily better than any of the decks that we have in solid tier 1. Next up is Pure Mitsu. So Pure Mitsu, you can argue lost like Feral Imps, but in the Pure deck, like they weren't even making Feral Imps to begin with for the most part. So I feel like this deck is pretty much untouched. Mitsurugi is still a very, very powerful engine, and especially if your opponent is not respecting this deck with cards like Droll and Lockbird in their side deck or main deck, this is a deck that I think can really pop off. Especially because I think Yummy is going to be a little bit more popular now post-Banlist. Mitsurugi just has a great matchup into the Yummy, and I think for all those reasons combined, like I'll have to put Mitsurugi like similar in a similar place as K9 Crystron. It's probably going to be the top of tier 1 potential. I could be like underselling the deck a tiny bit, but I feel like with this lack of representation lately, plus the fact that it is a deck that still has to play a couple of bricks, I feel like it's not going to go in that solid tier 1 category just yet, but it's still a very scary deck that I feel like you should be respecting in your deck building. Next up, getting into the different Risio variants, the only card that we lost was like 1 copy of X, and yeah, X was like the best starter in the deck, but that doesn't really take anything away from the deck other than its consistency. For Onomat Risio specifically, I think literally the only thing they lost was the 1 copy of X Risio. They definitely did lose one of their best starters, and the deck does become slightly less consistent, but I feel like the deck's position doesn't really change in the format overall. I still think this is a solid tier 2 deck. It can be pretty scary if it does get to go off, but I feel like this deck does suffer a few key weaknesses, like to a card like Droll and Lockbird, for example, and to a card like Fuelos, and especially since last format, it wasn't even seeing that much representation, if any at all, to begin with. I don't think that like this deck is suddenly going to get like better after they lost a copy of X Risio. Not too much to say about this deck. I think it's still fine, but I don't think this deck is like exceptional by any means. Mitsurugi Risio is an interesting one. They did lose King of the Feral Imps, so they did lose the bridge from the Risio engine to the Mitsurugi engine, and that can be pretty detrimental for the deck. So that significantly lowers the ceiling of the deck if you aren't able to hard draw some of the Mitsurugi cards. Now, if you only see like Risio cards and hand traps, for example, you're kind of stuck playing pure Risio. There is another way for you to bridge into the Mitsurugi engine, except by hard drawing it at this point. I think it's still worth mentioning, though, that it is possible for the Mitsurugi side to still bridge into the Risio side, because there is that rank 8 that's able to search 7 Tachyon. And if you see only Mitsurugi cards, yeah, it's possible for you to make that card and still access the Risio side of your deck. So I think that this deck still has that going for it. The fact that it did lose King of the Feral Imps means I feel like this deck sort of just drops to a similar level as Onomat Risio. Risio cards are still strong, but really feel like with its much lower ceiling, there's just little reason to play this version over like pure Mitsurugi at this point, which honestly might just be more consistent. Fiendsmith Risio, on the other hand, though, I think is interesting because, yes, even though we did technically lose a copy of Moon, and this deck, of course, did lose X, this deck didn't really need Moon to bridge into the Fiendsmith engine in the first place. They have very easy access to Exciton Knight, which is a rank 4 Light Fiend, and so this deck is still essentially untouched aside from the single copy of X Risio. That being said, though, I feel like this deck didn't really see much representation like before the ban list for good reason. It's not a deck that I think is terrible by any means, but I just feel like it's going to be lacking a little bit of consistency, especially now that it's lost a copy of X Risio. It's forced to play like some of the Fiendsmith bricks in the deck, and playing cards in this deck like 7 Tachyon can be a little bit awkward if you want to access the Fiendsmith side of your deck. So I feel like this sort of falls in a similar boat as like all the other Risio variants. Like, it's a totally okay deck, and if you see like the right hands where like the engines just happen to work well together, like the deck's still going to be great. But I do feel like this deck is not going to be anything really past tier 2, unfortunately, because once again, like, it wasn't even seeing that much representation last format even before we got the ban list. Next up is like Fiendsmith Mitsu, and this deck just isn't going to be a thing anymore. Like, no Moon means like there's no way for the Mitsurugi deck to bridge into the Fiendsmith deck, and not to mention there was already no way for the Fiendsmith to bridge into like the Mitsurugi deck. This deck was already sort of just an amalgamation of like 2 very good engines that didn't have any restrictions, and if you just happen to like see both of the engines, cool, your deck works really well. But if you only see one engine, like, you're essentially just playing that deck with the bricks of the other deck in it, if that makes any sense. Once again, I'll also say, like, this deck didn't see much representation, if at all, before the ban list, and I don't think that like losing a copy of Moon is really going to help make this deck any better. So I think this version of the deck is just not really going to be a thing anymore because there's no bridge between the 2 engines. Fiendsmith Orcust is also something I feel unfortunately falls into this tier. Like, I don't think this deck is going to be a thing anymore. You aren't able to use Moon to bridge into the Fiendsmith side of the deck. Yes, the Orcust cards are still going to be fine, and I think there are going to be other variants of Orcust that are somewhat playable, but I'll talk more about that in another tier list. This is more focused on like the Fiendsmith side of the deck. And then now for the other decks that weren't really meta relevant before, but maybe have some potential post-ban list. The first one is going to be Zodiac. Getting Barrage back to 3 and Dryden back to 1. It's obviously nice for the deck. It can function as a deck once again. It has like an end board it wants to go for. It now has 3 of its best extenders and starters, but I just feel like the Zodiac deck is just a little outdated at this point. If you like, I don't know how you can feel good about summoning Trident when a card like Detonator is just running around in the format. I really don't think Trident's like that good by today's standards. You as an engine could be interesting, even if the deck itself isn't really going to be a playable deck in my opinion. I think as an engine, there's some potential for the Zodiac deck for the Zodiac cards to be splashed. Like, they are very good at generating level 4 bodies. You have a card like Barrage, which can summon out Zodiac directly from deck without using your normal summon, and then you can climb up into a card like Chakanine, and then Chakanine can bring back a level 4 Zodiac from your graveyard, which can just give you an extra body. And plus, after using Chakanine as like an extender, you can simply just slap a Zodiac Trident on top and have an extra interruption on top of your end board. So I think that's something that maybe could see some experimentation, but in general, I don't think that the Zodiac deck itself is going to be very good. Going first is end board just not going to be strong enough, and going second it just becomes a very over-glorified like Zeus Turbo deck, which I don't think really works super well in the current format that we have with a deck like Yummy and Draco running around. Next up is Branded. Branded did get Branded Fusion from 1 to 2, and it is just a straight up buff to the deck. But I don't really feel like this deck's still going to be in a great position still. I think it'll be a decent tier 2 deck. Like, it's obviously still playable. If you want to put cards like Draco in there, I think you can experiment with that and give the deck a little bit of a higher ceiling, a little bit extra consistency. But overall, I feel like even though, yes, Brand Fusion is a very powerful card still, I don't think that it really shifts the dynamic of this deck in their metagame overall. There's still going to be a ton of cards they have to worry about, like Azuna, and just generally not being able to keep up with some of the best decks that we have at the moment. Next up is Snake Eyes. I think that's Snake Eyes. Yeah, we got Poplar and Ash back, and plus Link Rebuild back, which is pretty good. I didn't even mention that for Yummy. Like, Link Rebuild in Yummy is going to be very good, because now you'll always have either a way to protect your Herald of the Arclight from being run over, or you'll just always have an accessible Link 1 every single turn, because you just bring a level 1 body out, even if it has no effect, and even if you run out of cards like Snatchy, you can just use Link Rebuild to summon itself back, and then just get your Link 1 that way. But in these going back to Snake Eyes, I don't really think this deck is going to be exceptional. Like, it wasn't doing anything before. I don't think the third copy of Ash and Poplar is really going to push this deck over the edge. Without a card like Original Sinful Spoils, I still don't think this deck is really going to be doing too much. There is some small potential, I think, for the Snake Eyes cards to be used as an engine, I guess. You can use it in a deck like Yummy because they are level 1 monsters. You can sort of bridge from like the Snake Eyes engine to the Yummy engine, which I think is kind of cool, but I don't really think that this deck, as a deck itself, is going to be performing that well. That's going to be a similar story for True Draco, I think. Like, even though they did get Dragonic Diagram and Masterpiece off the ban list, I think this deck is like way past its prime. Masterpiece as a card, like, yeah, it can be slightly annoying for some decks to out, but most decks are just going to have a way to out it, because it's not going to be completely unaffected by every single card out there. Most decks play Imperm, like most decks have a spell way to out it, and then of course every deck has a monster way to out this card. So I don't think that True Draco is going to be that great. Even played as like a pure Sun deck, again, like every other Sun deck, you're going to have to win the dice roll for you to even have a chance, and even then you might still end up losing the game. So even though Draco, I think Dragonic Diagram is still a very good card, I don't think the Draco deck itself is going to be doing too much. Maybe there's some world where we can start trying to splash around like the Draco cards with like other decks that synergize with it, like the Sky Strikers, or even play a deck like Zodiac, like Zoo True Draco once again, like it's 2017. Like, yeah, maybe that could be an interesting rogue deck, but in terms of meta relevance, I don't really think that this deck's going to be doing too much. And then finally, we have Dinos. For those of you who played in 2017, you'll know that True King Dinos was one of the best decks, if not the best deck in the game. Basically, the synergy is like you can use Dragonic Diagram to pop a Baby Ceratosaurus in your hand, search a copy of Lithosagem. Baby Ceratosaurus will like trigger to get your Dino Engine going, and then you'll get to a point where you can use Lithosagem to pop 2 Baby Cerasauruses, look at your opponent's extra deck and banish 3 cards, and then trigger both the babies, because the babies' effects are not once per turn. I think that's something, it could be like a cool rogue combo deck, in my opinion. Once again, I think that deck is like way past its prime, and even though a card like Lithosagem can be good in theory, being able to completely devastate some extra decks, I just feel like this deck is not going to be consistent enough, like, to begin with, and going second is going to have a lot of struggles because it is a very engine heavy deck. So for all those reasons, I'll probably put it in like the very bottom tier. I don't think these decks are going to be very good. That's going to do it for this tier list. Let me know what you guys thought about in the comment section below. Do keep in mind these are just my initial thoughts, and this could be subject to change as the format goes on for the next few weeks. I didn't want to take too long on this because we are going to get Doom of Dimension soon, and I think that's going to shake up the meta even more. So I'll be doing a more in-depth and revised tier list once that comes out. But at least for now, these are just my initial thoughts immediately after getting the ban list. The really big change that's going to happen is that we are going to lose Vanquish Soul as one of the best decks in the format, and we're going to see a little bit more representation for decks like Yummy and Draco Tail. I think everything else is sort of going to stay around the same as it was before. Like, decks like Mitsurugi and Malice are still going to be pretty solid and pretty playable, but not the best decks by any means. But I'm curious to hear what you guys think. Do you guys enjoy this ban list? Do you guys think like some of these decks are better or worse than I'm giving it credit for? Let me know in the comment section below. But with all that being said, I just want to thank you all so much for watching, and I will see you guys in the next one. Take care.